Greetings, sisters and brothers, friends, fellow Pan-Africans. Welcome to African History Club, episode number 45. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. Today, once again, I'm going to be focusing on the conflict in Ethiopia. It continues to escalate, and things could actually get much more worse, catastrophically worse, in the coming days or weeks ahead. And that is why I decided to make it a focus today, once again. So this would actually be my third episode dealing with the conflict in Ethiopia. So what I'll try to do today is not to focus too much on the background and the history, because I dealt with those already in episode number 20, which was in December 2020. And then episode number 40, which was in August, in fact, August 23rd, 2021, also dealt with the ongoing conflict in Ethiopia. I fear that things could really escalate because a number of developments in recent weeks and even days. But first, allow me to give a very brief summary of the genesis of this conflict. And as I just said, for further details, please go to episode number 20 and episode number 40 of African History Club. The war really erupted November 3rd when the federal Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed ordered the National Army to launch an attack on the Tigray region. Tigray is one of Ethiopia's 10 regions. It has a population of about 7 million out of a total population of about 112 to 115 million in Ethiopia. And the official reason that Abiy Ahmed gave at the time was that the Tigray People's Liberation Force, which is the military of the region, all of the regions have their own armed forces, in addition to also contributing soldiers to the National Federal Army. So Abiy said the reason was for an attack, a military attack by the TPLF against a garrison of the Federal Army, which was stationed in the Tigray region. Now, that was the official reason, but in reality, the tension had escalated to boiling point between the federal government and the government in Tigray, which in essence was the TPLF. The TPLF had gone ahead and conducted elections in the Tigray region in September 2020 in defiance of Abiy Ahmed's decision to postpone constitutionally mandated national elections. And the reason the prime minister gave was the COVID pandemic, said this was not the right time to hold elections because there was already a political rift between the TPLF and Abiy Ahmed. The TPLF defied this decision by the prime minister and went ahead and conducted regional elections in Tigray. The prime minister, of course, saw this as an act of rebellion in essence. And that is the real reason why he launched the war against Tigray region. It was clearly premeditated because at the same time that the federal forces attacked from the south of Tigray, the neighboring country of Eritrea, under Isaias Afwerki, who has been the only president that Eritrea has known, also attacked Tigray from its north. So Eritrea attacked from the north, and the federal troops attacked from the south. As a result of the overwhelming force in which artillery was also used, and the Air Force was also used. The TPLF was driven out of Mekelle, which is the capital of the Tigray region, and within the same month of November, Abiy Ahmed was able to declare victory. Now, if some of you recall, when I first discussed this conflict in December 2020, I said this was a premature declaration. I said, knowing the history of Ethiopia and the history of the TPLF as having been the essential fighting force that led to the defeat of the military dictatorship of Mengistu Haile Mariam in 1991, I said this was premature and that there could be no military conflict, no military resolution to this conflict. So it was not entirely shocking to me or surprising when the tide changed rather dramatically in June 2021 on the ground, when the TPLF was able to defeat the federal army and drive it out of the Tigray region. Now, earlier reports before the reversal of the military situation on the ground occurred, there had been a number of reports by the United Nations and other human rights organizations documenting alleged human rights abuses by the federal army, which included mass executions, include mass rapes, and then later on, allegedly, the embargo of the region, the embargo of the Tigray region to deprive it of food and deliveries of medical and relief supplies. And reportedly, some of the worst crimes against civilians, including the massacres and the rapes and driving people off their land, was reportedly committed by the Eritrean forces. And I discussed the reason for that in my previous episodes. Eritrea and Ethiopia had fought a war in 1998 to 2000, and Eritrea was defeated in that border war. And the bulk of the military forces in the federal army of Ethiopia that was responsible for Eritrea's defeat came from Tigray. So Eritrea's leader has always harbored this desire for revenge. Now, in recent weeks, the United Nations has come out with new reports now saying that all sides, including the TPLF of Tigray, have also been committing human rights abuses, particularly since June 2021, when Tigray had the upper hand, gained the upper hand on the ground in terms of the military situation. But let me now focus to the primary reason why I'm very concerned and believe things could get catastrophically worse very quickly. Recently, the Security Council of the United Nations came out with a strong statement demanding a ceasefire to this conflict by all the sides involved in this war. Now, ordinarily, this would sound like something very positive, a positive development. But looking at the history of the United Nations engagement in Africa and the fact that all the members, the permanent members of the Security Council, which are the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, are on the same page, that is at the same time problematic when it comes to practice. And I say this by looking at the recent history of the United Nations engagement in Africa. And that recent history was, of course, Libya, when all the members of the Security Council, the 5 permanent members, were once again on the same page. And in that instance, in 2010, 2011, allegedly the mission was to prevent Gaddafi from, quote unquote, killing his own people in Libya. Ultimately, it led to the NATO war on Libya, using the umbrella and excuse of the Security Council having been on the same page. And all of you now know, excuse me, the history of what happened to Libya. Libya essentially has been returned to the Stone Ages because of the NATO war against Libya. And what were some of the real reasons for that war? Primarily, number one, it was to supplant Gaddafi and install a puppet regime. And that regime would then make Libya's oil available to the West on favorable terms, the terms they're used to, just such as when they deal with countries like Saudi Arabia. Libya, the oil was controlled by the National Oil Company, which was able to retain a significantly higher surplus, share of the surplus. And that is why Libya, under Gaddafi, had invested so much of its oil profits back into the economy and to the citizens of Libya, and had shared a significant portion of that surplus with the rest of the African continent. Most African countries were beneficiaries of Libya's oil surplus. How do I know this was a primary reason? Because some of these oil companies started signing deals with the puppet regime even before it was in power, before Gaddafi had been overthrown and brutally murdered. And this information is widely available. If anybody was not familiar with this, do the research on Google. Even so-called mainstream publications like Newsweek wrote about this, and I also discussed it in my book, Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. I discussed this in the introduction. A second reason was to prevent Libya from helping to launch a new African currency, which would be backed by Libyan gold. And this was clearly outlined as a concern primarily of France in a memo that Hillary Clinton's, one of her aides, I think it's Sid Blumenthal, wrote to her in a memo explaining what the primary motivation of France, that France had in terms of really aggressively pursuing the call to attack Libya. So that was a second consideration, because it would have significantly diminished the reliance on the dollar and on the French franc in West Africa. So France had another primary economic motive. And then finally, of course, it was Nicolas Sarkozy, who was the president of France at that time of the war on Libya, wanted to hide the fact that Gaddafi had given him money to run his presidential election, his campaign. And of course, recently, since that episode, Sarkozy has now been convicted of corruption in France. So that is why, once again, at this time, when the Security Council are issuing these strong demands to immediately effect a ceasefire, once again, I'm reminded of how things quickly escalated and led to the war against Gaddafi and the destruction of Libya. once again, we start wondering what other factors are really in play in this current situation in Ethiopia. And once we open the door for any outside intervention, similar to what happened to Libya, we will be opening up Pandora's box that we will be unable to control. So that is one of my main concerns. Obviously, if the African Union was a capable organization and not a toothless lion, this is the time that the AU would take the lead in demanding that all the sides come to the negotiating table. Now, here is the other reason of my major concern. Things have really taken a turn for the worse for the federal armed forces under Abiy, who actually launched this war on November 3rd, 2020. And now that the TPLF has announced an alliance with the Oromo Liberation Army, their prospects of being able to actually march to Addis Ababa, the federal capital, and to overthrow Abiy Ahmed's government seems much more possible. And that should not happen. That should not happen because, number one, it would lead to, once again, imposing a government in the capital that is dominated by the TPLF. We would end up with a situation similar to what presided between 1991 to 2018, where you have an ethnic minority population, which nevertheless has a superb fighting force, being the most influential factor in the federal government. And that, of course, comes with its negative sides. During the period 1991 to 2018, by the end of that period, there was resentment that had been building up toward the TPLF dominance of the coalition that comprised the federal government. And it had led to protest in the Oromo region as well as the Amhara region. And the Oromo, followed by the Amhara, make up the significant bulk of the population. That is why it's absolutely uncalled for the fighting forces to march and seize power absolutely in Addis Ababa. As a Pan-African and friend of all Ethiopians, obviously, I and colleagues like-minded call for a negotiated end to this conflict to deal with the aftermath. By taking over power in Addis Ababa, that could also lead to conflict between the Oromo and the Amhara and escalate the ongoing conflict between Amhara and Tigray. And then other regions that also had its issues with the federal government could now see that they can use armed forces to also push their own agenda, which could include breaking up from the federal united government of Ethiopia. So the whole country could go on a downward spiral of breaking up. And then finally, of course, we would have another escalation of the humanitarian crisis. Now the suffering, ongoing suffering, had been primarily in Tigray, and then in more recent weeks, as the fighting escalated, suffering of civilians had also reached the Amhara region as well as the Afar region. So if multiple conflicts were to erupt, we can imagine how many more times multiplied the suffering of the innocent civilians in Ethiopia would escalate. And that is why, once again, I reiterate that there's no military solution to this ongoing war in Ethiopia. And then finally, as a Pan-African, as I've indicated and I've said in many of my podcast episodes, that a lot of these crises that we see, political, economic crises that lead to these conflicts in African countries, can be traced to one thing at the end of the day. And that is the failure to form a United States of Africa. And that is why we still have issues of border disputes. We have issues of nationalities and ethnic conflicts. And at the end of the day, the primary pressure comes from weak African countries located at a certain position in the global chain. And in the case of Africa, all of the African countries located in the periphery of the global economy, exploited by the industrialized countries, most of them the former colonial powers. If you look at the situation as an overview, nothing has changed. In 1884-85, the continent was formally divided at the Berlin Conference, turned into plantations, producers of cheap labor and primary or raw materials to fuel the factories in the industrializing at that time, and industrialized in some cases, such as Britain, countries that became the colonial powers. Fast forward to the 21st century, the situation remains the same. African countries at the periphery providing the fuel that ignites the factories in the West, and now in China as well, and then being consumers of their manufactured products at an escalated price that results in their increased impoverishment every year. And that is the real reason why we have all these challenges. Neo-colonialism. Even though Ethiopia was the only African country that was never colonized, because heroically, which is kind of ironic, because they had all these same ethnic nationalities at that time. But when Italy invaded in 1896 to try to colonize Ethiopia, all these nationalities came together. Tigray, Amhara, Oromo, all these other nationalities to fight against the invading imperial Italian army, and defeated them decisively March 1, 1896 at the Great Battle of Adwa. That is when Ethiopia rose as a nation. And this is the moment that the legacy of that kind of history should also be on the minds of Ethiopians. Avoid a catastrophe. Negotiate an end to this conflict. Kwame Nkrumah was right. A United States of Africa would relieve us of the burden of many of these crises we now confront. On a recurring basis, we see the coup in Guinea, we see the coup in Mali, we see the coup d'etat in Chad, in Sudan, trying to reverse the process of democratization, we would avoid many of these crises if we had a United States of Africa. Kwame Nkrumah articulated this very well in many of his books, especially Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, as well as his other book, Africa Must Unite. I strongly recommend these two books. Comrades, sisters and brothers, Pan-Africans, let's keep demanding and insisting that our sisters and brothers in Ethiopia come to the negotiating table. Thank you for joining me, episode number 45. I will see you in episode 46.